Thank you, Esther.
Discussion.
Thank you, Esther, and thank you, Dr. Duraid, for such deep and insightful discussions on this crucial military institution and the climate change. So, as we know, climate change plays an increasingly crucial role in discussions of security. The global climate regime is very complex, and it often lacks the capacities to implement effective policies. Slowly but progressively, climate change is being put on the agenda of UN Security Council to evaluate its impact and instability and conflict. The 2015 Paris Agreement strengthened the global response to climate change. However, the negotiations highlighted deep divisions between the states. So, how important do you think is recognition by the international community of the severity of threats when discussing the subject of climate change? And to what extent does the recognition of the direct link between climate change and security play a role in addressing the fight against global warming?
Thank you, Arsan. A really important question, and I think that it's a relatively simple answer in that, I mean, I'm biased, but I would say it's extremely important. I think that recognition of the link between climate change and security will have a huge impact. The problem is that impact can be both positive and negative. So in terms of sort of the positive aspects, security is and always has been kind of one of the roles of the state and one of the roles of international organizations that is placed as a top priority role, you know, security, sort of economic stability and so forth. Because it is such, what that means is that using that narrative, increasing that level of recognition of that link between, you know, global heating and biodiversity loss and security can help to drive action. It can help to increase prioritization and increase funding. So as a focus area, it does have that potential to really catalyze action. And obviously the sort of additional aspect to that is that it can catalyze action both hopefully at the level of those international sort of organizations, hopefully, but even if it doesn't necessarily do that, because there's still going to be that those deep divisions between states. So even if it doesn't necessarily catalyze it at that level as much, what it can do, and in fact already is doing, is catalyzing action between security forces and epistemic communities. So in the way that, for example, in the way that it might be difficult for the Foreign Office of one country to engage with the Foreign Office of another country, what you can, because they have, you know, a lot of conflicting interests, what you can have is military officials, perhaps military officials who've ended up, you know, engaging with other military officials from countries that might be seen as adversaries in the past. They maybe have gone to college with these other officials. They've maybe sort of engaged with them through wider diplomatic talks. Those officials can actually agree on the nature of climate change as a serious security threat, and they can engage in a level of informal diplomacy because it's within the interests of both of those organizations to actually limit those threats. So whereas the UK might have difficulty engaging with, let's say, the Chinese government on certain targets, the UK military might have the potential for a bit more, you know, a bit more of a sort of informal diplomatic set of agreements with, you know, the Chinese PLA, because they are both very conscious of those risks and security threats, and they view it from a security lens. So I think it's very important in that sense, and it's positive in that sense. And on a separate note, there's research to show that communicating security, the kind of security implications of these challenges, is actually a very useful way of engaging with people who have a more conservative view of these issues and climate skeptics. You know, obviously, if you have a senior general from a military, which is a very traditional, masculine, conservative institution, you know, talking about the need to counteract or mitigate global heating, then suddenly it creates a more masculinized version of this as an issue, which can serve to sort of persuade people who might otherwise see this as something that is a highly feminized or kind of a wishy-washy issue, because obviously it is a commonly feminized issue in the way that it's presented across various sort of media and through various narratives. So those are some really beneficial outcomes that could have real impact. There are obviously potentially negative outcomes, and we talked about this earlier with the securitization issue. If this security narrative becomes too strong, it might mean that it diverts focus towards security solutions rather than development-based solutions, natural. So the role of the military in areas where they're not best served as a solution. As mentioned earlier, if we securitize it enough, we end up sending the military in to take control of a disaster relief operation in a scenario in which survivor-led resilience and rebuilding activities could have been more effective. It could also result in, whilst it might persuade climate skeptics, it could also result in marginalizing narratives and counterproductive narratives. So the obvious example of this is climate refugees, the climate refugee narrative. So if we continually push this concept of climate change as a security threat, and if we use it to push for that international support, we end up labeling migrants as security threats rather than individuals who need greater equity and greater development support and so forth. We overlook those nuances that are in those migration stories, such as, once everyone is classified as a climate migrant, you might overlook seasonal migration patterns or temporary migrants who return to their sort of, to their communities to then build those communities back. You overlook internal migration statistics in comparison to, cross-border migration. So, there's a lot of risks there in terms of how that narrative goes about. And there's a risk as well in terms of whether it creates a kind of inaction, in the way that it could spur significant action. It could also spur inaction if we focus wholly on security threats, security existential risk. These are important narratives and they need to be pushed out there, but we might end up giving people a sense that we are inevitably heading towards a sort of, highly militarized future populated by sort of interstate and intrastate conflict. And if we create that sense of inevitability, it can hamper sort of people's desire or their activities in pushing for more radical change to actually mitigate those sort of risks. Or we can end up focusing on things like adaptation to a disproportionate degree instead of striking the right balance between, adaptation and mitigation. It's got a lot of potential positive outcomes. It has a lot of potential negative outcomes. We still don't know how it's going to sort of pan out. There are promising signs, but as you kind of said at the beginning, Arslan, with those deep state divisions, this doesn't necessarily entail positive action. Just because something is raised in the UN Security Council, that doesn't mean it won't be vetoed. We're seeing Russia securitize their environmental agenda in a way that is highly protectionist. security forces can help and the security narrative can help, but those forces are still beholden to their governments for guidance and approval. They can't just go off and, on expeditionary operations to stop counter-poaching without that governmental approval. So yeah, there's a lot still to be worked out there, but I think there's some really positive aspects, there's some really positive potentials there, and there are some, risks that we need to keep an eye on to avoid.
Thank you very much, Dr. Duraid, for this highlighting the role of narratives in this. And if I could follow you up on the interstate conflicts, there is a boiling pot, if I may say, the issue of trans-boundary water cooperation. While water has occasionally been the source of conflict between riparian countries, major global organizations such as Global High Level Panel and UN have made it imperative to address the issue of the issue following the global hydrological imbalance in water cycle due to climate change. We have seen in states like South Asia, where India and Pakistan have recently exchanged some spats over water being as a weapon, or recently in Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, where they have clashed over the issue of water, and in the past in Middle East, where there have been conflicts over water cooperation. The upper riparian countries seem to have an obvious geostrategic advantage over downstream states, and there are various other examples where tensions between states for water have made human security more vulnerable to the severity of the consequences of climate change. So how do you think such scenarios will play out in the context of climate change over growing water insecurity, and how can riparian countries ensure water cooperation in this growing global water crisis?
Thank you. It's a really sort of important and interesting question, and I'm going to have to say up front, firstly, that I'm not sort of as much of an expert on water insecurity as many other scholars out there, and I'm also going to, I should say up front that I'm also going to give a slightly annoying academic answer to this, at least to provide some context. So the premise of your question is really important, increasingly urgent for us to address. I think it is undeniable that water access, water scarcity has been a factor in various sort of conflicts. There are statistics out there that say that there's been a sort of, a 50% increase in conflicts over water, sort of within the 21st century or so forth. But this is also an area, in terms of looking at how these scenarios will play out, it's also an area where it's really important for us to take a step back and to sort of question our assumptions about water conflict. There's this strong idea of a causal link between water insecurity and interstate conflict in particular. That's a very popular idea. It is a concept that grabs our attention. It's a narrative that seems to have a really logical and almost inevitable kind of truth to it, or outcome to it. If fresh water or potable water is an increasingly scarce resource in certain areas, and if states have historically fought over scarce natural resources, then yes, we can assume that water scarcity will inevitably result in conflict. That's the kind of logic. So we see this concept of water wars reappearing in a very cyclical fashion across news and articles and books and journals and even academic literature. But we need to be really careful about these concepts of water conflict, about these concepts of, and about securitizing issues of water scarcity and buying into narratives that reinforce sort of really simplistic causal links between water scarcity and violence or peace, particularly between states. And I know that this isn't what you're doing with your question, but as an academic, I always feel the need to sort of jump in and give that kind of proviso. So there are a lot of, I think in terms of how it's gonna pan out, related to what I was saying about looking at those causal links, in a lot of the sort of case studies that we see about water scarcity, there's, there are areas of conflict, but there are also a wide number of areas where you have water cooperation between states, a large number of case studies where that has happened. Scarcity has led to increased cooperation. You also see, I mean, we talk about riparian states, but again, a significant number of, a significant amount of conflict that might happen in relation to water scarcity happens generally within states at the intrastate level, rather than between states at that interstate level. And the ways in which this impacts on security can be really subtle and complex. And we're continually finding out about sort of the gender issue that we've mentioned before. For example, there is an increased impact on. There's an increased gender disparity in the way that it impacts. So when we think about what the outcomes of these conflicts might be in a very broad way, and I'll try to get on to the examples that you talked of in just a second, but in a very broad way, it's important for us to look at this from a broader perspective rather than just the interstate conflict perspective, to look at it from a gender perspective, to look at it from an internal perspective, even to look at it from a kind of global economic perspective. A major factor that's exacerbating water insecurity is not the conflict that might be happening between states or climate change per se, but it's the issue of embedded water within manufacturing processes. When we buy goods from other countries, whether that's clothing or food or raw materials or whatever, we're taking water away from that country. It's water that's contained within a product or used in a manufacturing process, or it's water that's lost when we, take a raw material from the ground and the mining process destabilizes or depresses a water table. And that leads to a large loss of groundwater from a large area. So when we think about water conflict, we need to relate it out to these wider contexts. And that helps us understand that we all play a significant role in creating solutions to these issues. We all have a role to play in sort of isolating riparian states, for example, as somehow other or isolated actors, or as being the ones who face these risks, and in helping us understand that the security implications of water scarcity aren't simply at the local human security level or the regional interstate level, but they can also have global socioeconomic impacts. So a really long and rambling preface, and I'm really sorry about that. But so what does this mean for riparian states? Given that nuance, if we look at, you sort of talked about India and Pakistan, and you're absolutely right. They have started, there are a lot of sort of, there's a lot of increased sort of disputes over water, and there's a deepening rift that is occurring. And you say they're threatening each other with water as a geopolitical weapon, and you're absolutely spot on there. And obviously this isn't helped by the fact that you have, let's say India developing upstream water infrastructure projects that reduces the amount of water to sort of Pakistan. It's going to be exacerbated significantly by climate change. You have, these glaciers, the Himalayan glaciers that feed that kind of Indus basin. They'll gradually disappear over time, and that'll deplete the groundwater resources. And that's very damaging to both countries. And that has the ability to really exacerbate those conflicts between the two states. Particularly because they both have really significant agricultural sectors. So, those sectors are very dependent on that irrigation, heavily dependent on those agricultural sectors for their internal food provision. But those contexts are actually a really good example as to how we can't really predict the future prospects of water conflict. We can't predict in which direction it's going to go necessarily. And in order to come out with a really good picture of where it might go, we need to consider a wide range of other factors. So if there was less territorial conflict over the Kashmir region, then water cooperation might be far easier prospect for both governments. So is it water that's creating the issue, or is it Kashmir that is inhibiting them collaborating on water? Similarly, if there was significantly increased investment made into drought proofing both Pakistan and India's agricultural sectors, that might significantly reduce the potential for conflict. So a refocusing of investment could have a significant impact on the level of conflict between them. And of course, as with that sort of water scarcity issue is only one part of this. There are major issues of water pollution and waterborne diseases. So those impact on health problems and health infrastructure. So again, if we were to deal with those wider water-related issues that are sort of connected in a way to these wider ecological trends, then does that help us to create a foundation for better cooperation? So yeah, I think there's a lot of complexity and there's a lot of difficulty in being able to predict what's going on. I think there are a number of possible outcomes. Let's say if we take that India-Pakistan, that India-Pakistan sort of, I don't want to call it a conflict, but tension, shall we say? We could predict any number of outcomes. It could develop into, there might be increased internal disunity rather than interstate conflict. You might see a growth in the size and intensity of those farmers' protests that we're already seeing in India. That leads to greater crackdowns on protests in India. That leads to increased inequity in protests until there's some form of tipping point that either leads to a change in government, to better investments or policy, or to far more negative outcomes. We might see attacks on Indian dams, which further strain interstate relations. We might see, as evidenced by the pandemic, some other unforeseen external factor or mutual threat that ends up forcing those states to engage in increased water diplomacy and unity. I think if I were to say, what can we do? What are the kind of, as you sort of note in your question, Aslan, how can we ensure water cooperation in this sort of growing crisis? I would echo the comments of one of my colleagues at King's, Dr. Naho Miramachi, who argued very recently. She noted that there do exist a wide range of bilateral and multilateral cooperative agreements, but we seriously need to change our water diplomacy structures, because the current structures that we have tend to privilege certain states or communities over others, rather than helping us achieve what is a just transition for all stakeholders. And this is really integrally linked to a really important point about water insecurity, which is that, yes, they can cause strains on diplomatic relations. Yes, they can result in clashes, generally minor clashes between states. And there are political narratives. They can result in political narratives that further the rift, that reduce the level of diplomacy that occurs between those states. They can have those effects, certainly. But the real security threat, the one with the greatest and the most immediate impact, is that threat to human security. It's the threat to the livelihoods, the welfare and the well-being of the individual citizens within those separate countries. In the India and Pakistan example, that's particularly those sort of within the agricultural sector, but obviously negative impacts to that sector then have vast repercussions, both within those countries and regionally. So that's why we need to, in seeking to sort of solve these issues, we need to change our kind of current means of engaging water diplomacy to account for those issues, to make sure that there is a just transition, to make sure that there is an increasing focus on that kind of human security versus interstate security impact. And that sort of links back to what you were saying as well about, you have major global organizations such as the Global High Level Panel, the UN, who've made it imperative to address this issue, who are pushing this issue as being a global priority. So, we need to have a think about, what is the value and tangible impact of those organizations in comparison to alternative means of solving these issues. No easy answers, unfortunately, but as with everything, I think there are a lot of potential solutions out there, and it's a question of, let's say, garnering that political willpower to engage with these more complex or less politically expedient narratives in order to really seek to generate more fundamental changes and solutions.
Thank you, Dr. Duraid. Thank you for such a detailed and very insightful analysis and thoughts on this. So, Esther?
Well, I think with this, we generally tend to the conclusion of our podcast. What do you think, Arsan? And
yes, it was totally spot on, and the conclusion was very well and relevant to today's topic. And Dr. Duraid, thank you so much again for your presence. It was a really pleasure and an honor to have you with us.
Thank
Thanks
you
a
so
lot.
much.
My pleasure completely, and thank you for such timely and important questions, I would say.
Thank you once again.